Welcome, folks, to the Deep Dive. I apologize if I sound a little high speed, but that's what happens when you accidentally fall down a truly deranged historical rabbit hole at 3 in the morning.
Tuckles, it happens.
I was reading through the source documents you guys shared, and I realized that a core piece of modern British finance is built on a financial structure so utterly bizarre, you have to read it 3 times just to confirm it's not, satire.
It's the kind of history that makes you question everything you thought you knew about a word like justice.
Exactly.
Especially when you attach it to the word abolition.
Yes. We are diving into the most complex, politically fraught topic in modern global finance. Reparations for slavery. But here's the central mind-bending paradox we're starting with. We aren't talking about reparations for the enslaved.
No.
We are talking about the UK compensating the slave owners. A massive national debt that was serviced by British taxpayers, including us, until 2015. And while that debt was being settled, the same government is now fighting off demands for potentially trillions in reparations for the descendants of the people who were actually brutalized. I mean, you can't make this up.
And that is precisely the mission today. We are going to synthesize the financial history, the legal gymnastics, and the diplomatic showdown that are captured in this stack of sources.
Right.
We really need to distill 2 things. The scale of the historical financial trauma, and then the staggering, almost theoretical scale of the modern demands from that Brattle Group quantification to the structural solutions CARICOM is proposing.
We're tracking the money, the math, and the political maneuvering happening right now. And our historical pivot point is crystal clear. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, it was hailed globally as this moral triumph, a defining moment of justice.
So-called justice.
Right, so-called justice. But its financial architecture was fundamentally ridiculously unjust. It ensured a generational wealth transfer to the oppressors. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the ultimate punchline of historical injustice, the price of emancipation. So in 1833, Parliament passes the Abolition Act. It formally frees approximately 800,000 enslaved Africans across the British Empire.
Primarily in the Caribbean, yeah.
On the surface, that's a moral win, right? But wrong. The crucial clause was that the government agreed to pay a massive compensation package of £20 million.
20 million.
But it went exclusively to the slave owners as restitution for the loss of their property.
And we have to be clear, it wasn't just a large sum. It was an astronomical sum for the time.
Put it in context for us.
Well, that £20 million was nearly 40% of the National Treasury's annual income.
40%.
40. To put that in terms of, current governmental spending, it was equivalent to roughly 5% of the UK's entire GDP. This wasn't some minor handout. It was one of the single largest state interventions in financial history.
It's just, wait, let me reread that for the people in the back. 0 compensation, no land, no freedom dues, no vocational training.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Nothing for the people who were actually freed.
Nothing whatsoever for the 800,000 human beings who had their lives and labor stolen. The money went entirely to the oppressors. This was financial architecture built on moral bankruptcy.
It really was. It enshrined the principle that property rights superseded human rights.
And that's where the debt mechanism kicks in, which is the truly shocking part for modern taxpayers.
Yeah.
This is the core of the financial argument for reparations today.
Exactly. So to fund this massive package immediately, the government had to borrow the money. They did it by issuing bonds, which we call gilts.
Right.
This specific debt was later rolled into something called an undated gilt, specifically the 4% consolidated loan.
That term alone sounds incredibly ominous. It sort of speaks to the kind of long-term financial shell game the government was playing. How does an undated gilt let a debt last for 180 years?
Well, that's the technical nuance that's often missed. The term undated is absolutely key. It meant the gilt was issued with an earliest potential redemption date.
So a date they could pay it off.
A date they could pay it off, yes. In this case, 1957. But redemption wasn't compulsory then. The UK government was only obligated to keep servicing the interest payments, potentially forever.
In perpetuity.
Potentially, yes. Since the principal was never required to be paid off, the debt incurred solely to compensate slave owners remained on the books. It was fully serviced by British taxpayer funds right through until the final cancellation and repayment of that consolidated loan in 2015.
2015. 180 years later. That is just, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
I was paying taxes, you were paying taxes toward compensating the families of people who had enslaved other human beings.
And that is the moral arithmetic that stands, really regardless of the financial mechanics. Some sources will argue the bond was technically refinanced in 1927 or reborrowed through other means.
But that's irrelevant, right?
It's irrelevant to the core fact. The obligation, the principal sum tied to compensating slave owners, was not fully extinguished until 2015 via taxpayer-funded debt servicing.
So the crucial injustice is that the descendants of the enslaved, people born and working in the UK, paid taxes toward compensating the very people who enslaved their ancestors. Are we seeing this? This structural transfer of harm?
We are seeing it. And that wealth didn't just diffuse into the economy, it was highly concentrated, and it cemented the dominance of London's financial institutions.
Yeah, the records show an incredible concentration. I saw that 10 specific accounts handled £2.2 million of that compensation money. This influx of capital solidified the dominance of London's merchant banks.
It basically built the city as we know it today, and the anecdotal evidence links this directly to the foundations of aristocratic wealth. You mentioned the Lascelles family, the owners of Harewood House.
Right up in Yorkshire.
They received £26,307 for over 1,200 enslaved people.
And what's that in today's money? It must be huge.
Well, if you adjust it based on its share of GDP at the time, so the size of the intervention, it's equivalent to about £128 million today. That windfall funded the lavish maintenance of their estates and, ensured their continued place in the UK elite.
And it wasn't just the planters. I think what's so wild is that the financial intermediaries, the agents, they became massive beneficiaries of this whole thing. It was a bureaucratic gold rush.
Oh, absolutely.
I read about this one guy, Henry David Blythe. He wasn't a planter. He was a London-based agent who handled over 1,300 compensation awards, mostly for Mauritian planters who couldn't be in London to process their own claims.
And that agency function was extremely profitable. Blythe's firm reportedly generated £25,000 in commission fees alone.
Wait. His commission fee was £25,000.
That's right.
That's more than many individual slave owners received in total compensation.
Precisely. And this highlights a critical point. The facilitation of the transaction itself was a major financial beneficiary of abolition. Agents were advertising competitively to secure the business of handling these claims.
So this wasn't just a payment. It was a massive government-backed injection of capital into the financial services sector.
Exactly. Reinforcing London's position as the nexus of global capital. It was a state-sanctioned gold rush built entirely on human suffering.
It's unbelievable. Okay, so let's pivot hard.
Yeah.
How exactly did this compensation wealth turbocharge the Industrial Revolution? Or is that just, a popular myth?
Well, that's the key academic shift that modern quantitative history has achieved. For decades, historians tended to downplay the role of profits from the slave trade itself.
You mean the shipping of people?
The shipping, yes. They'd argue those profits were small, maybe 0.5% of GDP. But modern research emphasizes slaveholding, the colonial plantations, and the wealth derived from them over just the trade.
And the numbers for holding are vastly larger.
Oh, yes. Profits from slaveholding were estimated at closer to 5% of British GDP in the late 18th century, so an order of magnitude greater than the direct trade profits.
Okay, so the compensation payment of 1833 essentially forced a rapid reallocation of that wealth. Explain that structural shift for us. I saw the phrase improvement in investment productivity. What does that mean?
Okay, so if you look at the economics, these slave owners suddenly received massive, secure, lump sum government payouts. It was guaranteed money for assets people that were becoming increasingly unstable and politically risky to hold overseas.
Right.
So investors shifted that capital from those risky colonial ventures into domestic fixed capital, things like canals, railways, and factories in Britain.
So instead of reinvesting uncertain plantation profits back into the Caribbean, they used the secure government-backed compensation cash to buy fixed assets right here in Britain.
Exactly. And researchers have actually found that the regions in Britain with greater access to this slavery compensation investment, so places where slaveholders or their descendants lived and reinvested this windfall, those places experienced a faster structural transformation.
So you can actually measure it.
You can. The data shows these areas had measurably higher property values, higher manufacturing employment, more cotton mills, and a greater number of steam engines immediately following the 1830s.
So the compensation paid to the owners provided the sudden liquid capital accumulation that was necessary to spur the capital-intensive manufacturing sector in specific British regions. The cotton mills running on steam engines were directly linked through this compensated finance to the fortunes generated by sugar and tobacco plantations.
The argument is that this access to secure slavery wealth acted like an improvement in investment productivity for the British economy as a whole, but with huge distributional consequences. It raised the real income and wealth of capitalists in those connected regions, ensuring slavery wasn't just some sideshow.
It played an essential capital accumulating role.
A central role in shaping the physical and financial geography of the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, let's fast forward 180 years. The UK finally settles the slave owner debt in 2015, and suddenly the global community is hammering on the door with its own bill. And this one has like 15 zeros.
This is where historical injustice meets modern global law.
Right.
And the foundation for this modern movement was really laid in 2001 at the UN World Conference Against Racism in Durban. This is where slavery and the slave trade were explicitly termed a crime against humanity.
Which sounds like a clear legal victory for reparationists.
It was a moral victory, definitely, but it was a legal compromise. It was phrased meticulously to establish a moral foundation without creating immediate legal liability.
How so?
The final declaration stated that slavery is a crime against humanity and should always have been so. That conditional phrasing was pushed very hard by Western states, including the UK, to shield themselves.
The classic diplomatic sidestep. Acknowledge the evil, deny the legal responsibility.
Precisely. The main legal shield used by former colonial powers is the principle of non-retroactivity. The argument goes that since slavery was legal under the laws of the time—
Which they wrote,
yes. You cannot retroactively apply modern definitions of crime against humanity to historical acts.
But hold on, international law accepts that some war crimes, like genocide, are exempt from statutes of limitation. Why doesn't the severity of chattel slavery, a decades-long systemic crime against a whole population, why doesn't that automatically override the non-retroactivity defense?
That is the core legal and philosophical confrontation. Opponents argue that while slavery clearly meets the criteria of a systematic attack on a population, there is no international consensus that colonialism itself is a crime against humanity. So claims for reparations are complicated because you must prove that the actions of a state were illegal under the existing laws of that time, which they were not. Proponents, of course, counter that the laws of the time were European law created specifically to justify exploitation, which makes the whole retroactivity argument a circular defense.
Justice has to outweigh the technicalities, they would argue.
Exactly.
Okay, so regardless of the legal ambiguity, the economic analysis is out there. They're attempting to put a number on the scale of the injury. Let's talk about the Brattle Group report from 2023.
This was a major pro bono effort commissioned by the University of the West Indies, and it attempted to quantify the total harm caused by transatlantic chattel slavery across 19 million people over 4 centuries.
And the headline number they came up with it's almost theoretical. It's so big.
The Brattle Group quantified certain elements of reparations to be between $100 and $131 trillion. Owed by 10 nations.
131 trillion. That number is so massive it almost loses all meaning.
Yeah.
What's the UK's specific bill in this nightmare scenario?
The UK's estimated reparatory debt is $24 trillion, or about 18.6 trillion pounds. And to anchor that number, Jamaica's portion of the overall global harm is estimated at $9.5 trillion alone.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because this isn't just about stolen wages. They broke down the harm into these specific, often subjective categories.
That's the big methodological shift. The largest quantified harms are not the economic labor losses, but the emotional and violent categories, which are inherently difficult to price.
Like what?
For example, gender-based violence, so rape, forced breeding, systemic sexual assault. That's estimated at $11.8 trillion. Mental pain and anguish comes in at a stunning $24 trillion.
Wow.
And the low bound for uncompensated labor, so the stolen wages brought forward with interest, is only $191 billion, which just shows you how heavily the valuation weighs psychological and physical trauma.
That completely changes the conversation.
Right.
It means the calculation's less about wages and more about deep, lasting psychological, physical, and familial damage. How? How did they even reach numbers like 24 trillion for anguish? What legal anchor do you use to price suffering from the 19th century?
Well, that's the major point of critique, and the report's authors knew it would be controversial. They had to use anchoring points from modern tort law because no historical precedent exists for valuing these kinds of non-pecuniary losses.
So they're using modern legal cases.
They use statistics drawn from, for example, U.S. 9/11 victim compensation claims, which established legal frameworks for valuing lost life and future anguish, and also U.S. state records from the 1980s regarding personal injury cases.
Okay, so they bridge the centuries. They're arguing. If modern U.S. tort law provides a basis for valuing the loss of life and suffering from a sudden tragedy like 9/11, they can use that methodology to calculate the aggregate loss of life and suffering over centuries of systemic violence.
Exactly. Now, opponents argue that using modern U.S. tort law and data from the late 20th century to calculate damages for 19th century UK Caribbean slavery is fundamentally flawed and culturally irrelevant.
Sure.
But the author's rationale is that any valuation requires a recognized legal anchor, and modern tort law provides the only established mechanism for valuing that kind of psychological damage.
So the critique is the methodology, even if the intent is to highlight the sheer scale of the injury. Okay, let's move to the second key legal argument supporting the claims: unjust enrichment.
Lay that out for us. This is where the link between that 1833 compensation and the modern reckoning becomes absolutely crucial.
Proponents argue that the UK state continues to benefit from the immense surplus wealth generated by slavery, the same wealth that was funneled into the Industrial Revolution we just discussed. The UK has been unjustly enriched at the expense of African descendants.
Mm-hmm.
And since the UK state is the same legal entity, it can't just discard these historical debts. The financial scaffolding is still there.
And the counter-argument is, as you can imagine, fiercely defended.
Of course.
Anti-reparations arguments state that this notion of unjust enrichment has no public international legal foundation when you apply it across centuries. And furthermore, they argue that current wealth in the UK is largely the result of 2 centuries of post-abolition innovation and labor, not just historical theft.
So it's the difficulty of proving causation across 180 years. It's a challenge to trace the specific trajectory of financial harm.
Exactly. There's a difficulty in finding, and this is the key phrase, concrete, measurable, uncontested proof that current disadvantage is attributable solely to 18th century slavery and no other intervening factor. And that difficulty is what the colonial powers lean on very heavily to rule out cash payments.
Which brings us to the Caribbean community, CARICOM, because they are not waiting for a $131 trillion lawsuit to clear the International Court of Justice.
Chuckles, no.
They realized that demanding simple monetary compensation might be a diplomatic non-starter. So they pivoted brilliantly to a comprehensive 10-point plan that's focused on structural developmental repair.
And this is where the conversation gets extremely practical. It focuses on systemic consequence rather than abstract numbers. CARICOM argues the debt isn't just monetary, it's a colonial mess that requires targeted resources to unpick systems that were never built to serve the formerly enslaved.
And their priority number 1 is not cash, which I think is very telling. It's a full formal apology.
It is absolutely crucial. CARICOM is adamant that UK government statements of regret or sorrow are wholly insufficient.
Because they don't admit a crime was committed?
Exactly. They refuse to acknowledge that specific systematic crimes against humanity were committed. A full apology has to accept unequivocal responsibility, commit to non-repetition, and crucially, pledge to repair the harm caused, which links the apology directly to the 9 other points.
Okay, let's dive into those structural points because they address the long-term intergenerational efficiency of the harm. Point 5, assistance in remedying the public health crisis. This is a scientific and historically specific claim.
And it's deeply compelling because it connects historical policy directly to modern biology. The argument is that Afro-descendant Caribbean populations have the world's highest incidence of chronic, non-communicable diseases, particularly hypertension and type 2 diabetes.
Right, and this is argued to be a direct biological and sociological legacy. But how does slavery cause hypertension 2 centuries later?
Well, there are multiple mechanisms cited. First, you have intergenerational stress and trauma. The persistent systemic terror of slavery alters physiological stress responses, which can lead to epigenetic changes that are passed down.
So it's literally in the DNA.
It can make descendants more susceptible to chronic stress diseases, yes. Yeah. And second, nutritional deprivation. Colonial diets were often engineered for efficiency, not health. Heavy caloric restriction, high reliance on salted, preserved meats.
To extend shelf life.
Right. And low diversity of fresh produce. This engineered a metabolic legacy that, when combined with modern diets, creates a public health disaster.
So the argument is that slavery didn't just cause poverty. It created a metabolic and physiological disaster that the region can't handle on its own.
Correct. Addressing this requires a massive injection of capital, medical technology, screening programs, specialist expertise, all of which is beyond the current capacity of the region's health services. It's a central, demonstrable pillar of the reparative claim.
And the plan doesn't stop at the physical body. It addresses the mind, education, identity. I'm looking at points 4, 7, and 8, which focus on cultural and psychological damages.
I mean, the loss of identity and systematic destruction of historical memory is deemed a specific crime. Think about the erasure of African lineage records, the prohibition of languages, the suppression of cultural practices. CARICOM demands the establishment of cultural institutions, the return of heritage artifacts, and programs for African knowledge to address that deliberate policy of alienation.
And point 7, psychological rehabilitation, that addresses the intergenerational trauma.
The science is clear that trauma can be transmitted across generations. Medical and sociological evidence supports the concept that systemic racial victimization and dehumanization over centuries can alter mental health outcomes for descendants.
And we also need to hit the economic and structural gaps. Point 3 demands an Indigenous Peoples Development Program, acknowledging that they were also victims of genocide and land theft.
Absolutely. The repair has to be comprehensive. And looking at the economic long game, point 10 demands debt cancellation and monetary compensation. This isn't just a cash handout. It's framed as stopping ongoing financial damage.
Okay, lay out that debt argument for us. Why is Caribbean external debt considered part of this colonial mess?
The Caribbean nations argue that their external debts are a modern form of financial extraction. You know, these governments emerged from colonialism, inheriting massive deficits in education, infrastructure, community health.
Everything.
They were forced to borrow funds from international institutions just to clean up the colonial mess and build basic infrastructure. And this perpetual borrowing cycle prevents them from achieving their right to development and fiscal sovereignty.
So they see this debt as a direct cost of transitioning from a destroyed colonial structure to a functional, independent nation.
Precisely. And then point 9, technology transfer. That's about addressing a systemic deficit. The denied access to science and technology culture generations ago, the continued exclusion of youth from global innovation due to a lack of capital and infrastructure represents an undue burden on these developing states.
The whole 10-point plan, from illiteracy to repatriation to health, is about lifting the colonial anchor that still holds them back.
Exactly.
So how are the former colonial powers, particularly the UK, responding to this detailed structural reckoning now that the compensation to owners is finally paid? The political reaction has been evasive and highly defensive.
Well, the prevailing UK government position, championed by leaders like Keir Starmer, insists the UK must be forward-looking.
Right.
They've ruled out cash payments or issuing a formal apology that accepts legal liability. Starmer has called the slave trade abhorrent, but believes countries should focus resources on current challenges like climate finance.
So they're attempting to steer the conversation away from liability toward a non-committal development aid model. But that approach took a massive diplomatic blow in 2024.
It really did. The global community is forcing the issue. At the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa in October 2024, the leaders resolved that the time has come for a conversation on reparatory justice.
And that resolution was achieved despite the UK's reported insistence that the issue was strictly not on the agenda.
It was not. The final communique, which is a major diplomatic document, acknowledged transatlantic slavery as a crime against humanity.
So the UK essentially lost the battle to veto the discussion entirely among its former colonies. What was the compromise? The pivot to non-cash solutions.
That's it. The UK is now open to discussing non-cash forms of reparatory justice. This includes structural support like offering debt relief, restructuring financial institutions, and providing economic support or educational programs.
The emphasis is entirely on solutions that do not imply legal liability or direct monetary payment. Okay, so while the government is digging in its heels, one institution is trying to get ahead of the curve and model a non-governmental solution: the Church of England. They've admitted involvement and are putting serious money on the table.
It's a critical case study in institutional repentance, for sure. The church commissioners are creating the Fund for Healing, Repair, and Justice in recognition of their predecessors' financial involvement in slavery, specifically through Queen Anne's bounty.
So how much money are we talking about, and what principles are guiding this fund?
The initial commitment is £100 million to be dispersed over 5 years, but the aspiration is much larger. They hope to mobilize over £1 billion through attracting third-party matching funds.
$1 billion.
$1 billion. And the fund will be Black-led and guided by specific theological and ethical principles, like shalom and ubuntu.
Define those briefly for us.
Shalom is a Hebrew concept meaning comprehensive peace and justice so. Not just an end to war, but establishing systemic harmony. And Ubuntu is a Southern African concept, I am because we are, emphasizing that individual well-being is linked to community well-being.
So these principles shift the focus entirely from transactional compensation to structural healing.
They do. And critically, like the UK government's pivot, they are avoiding the direct cash payout model.
Explicitly.
Explicitly. The fund will not pay cash compensation to individuals or provide grants to governments. It will instead invest in Black-led initiatives backing social entrepreneurs, educators, healthcare providers, historians to address inequalities directly in affected communities.
But I've seen the critiques of this. Critics question why the focus is on developing Black fund managers and social entrepreneurs, rather than the principal victims themselves, descendants living in deep poverty whose immediate needs are for cash.
It shows the complexity of the debate. Even when money is committed, the question remains, who gets it and how?
Let's shift to cultural restitution, another core demand. The return of artifacts, like the Benin bronzes, is often conflated with reparations, but the sources show it's a complex ethical mess even within the movement.
The Benin bronzes, looted during the brutal 1897 invasion of Benin City by the British, are the global symbol of cultural reclamation, and museums have begun the process of ethical returns.
Right. But the complication is that addressing this historical wrong runs straight into another internal ethical problem.
It does. The Restitution Study Group, which is composed largely of descendants of enslaved Africans, argues fiercely that returning the bronzes exclusively to the Oba of Benin ignores the broader diaspora.
And why is that?
The key reason: the bronzes were cast using Manila-specific types of copper or brass bracelets that were a standardized currency used in the slave trade to purchase human captives.
Wait, so the argument is that the Benin Kingdom was also involved in the slave trade, profiting from selling human beings to Europeans?
Absolutely. The RSG argues that if the bronzes were literally cast from the currency of the slave trade, they should not be returned only to the former slave trading kingdom, which was itself an agent of oppression. They argue these objects are the heritage of the entire transatlantic diaspora.
What an ethical Gordian knot. Trying to redress colonial looting while simultaneously acknowledging pre-colonial African complicity in the trade.
It's an impossible position.
So let's step back and look at the crux of the fairness argument that continually comes up in the UK House of Lords debates. It's this difference between moral justice and legal proof.
The ultimate disagreement comes down to attribution. Proponents, like Professor Alan Lester, argue there is a clear prima facie case for reparations based on moral justice. They acknowledge that assets, human beings, land, health, were systematically destroyed and couldn't pass down through generations, creating a massive intergenerational deficit.
But the opponents demand certainty.
They question the legal certainty. Is the current socioeconomic disadvantage demonstrably attributable only to 18th century slavery and no other factor? Things like internal governmental corruption, post-colonial land policies, or other intervening historical events.
Right.
And since finding that concrete, measurable, uncontested proof that present disparities are legally traceable only to British slavery is extraordinarily difficult, the question of fairness for current taxpayers remains the core challenge for those who oppose cash payments.
So it's the difference between acknowledging a massive historical wrong and being able to create a specific legally binding chain of financial liability across nearly 2 centuries of complex history. The UK is saying, we agree it was bad, but prove that our bad act is the sole cause of that person's current poverty. This has been a deeply complex, high-velocity dive, folks. Let's bring it home with the 3 key facts that should absolutely stick with you.
Go for it.
1. The British government paid massive compensation, £20 million to slave owners in 1833, not the enslaved. 2. That debt was financed by UK taxpayers until 2015. And 3. Today, the price tag for the resulting harm is quantified at over $100 trillion globally, which is driving the CARICOM demand for systemic structural repair over simple cash payouts.
And this isn't just history from a textbook. This is 21st century geopolitics and finance that impacts treasury divisions and diplomatic relations today. The UK is trying to look forward by only offering non-cash support, but the global community is forcing it to confront the financial scaffolding of the past.
That structural debt, the one we just repaid, created an incredible efficiency of intergenerational harm that is still visible in health statistics and educational outcomes today.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you process all this. If the goal is truly healing, repair, and justice, how should the world reconcile two historically conflicting paths? You have the American model, where the enslaved were freed with no compensation paid to owners, which led to Southern economic collapse and has resulted in ongoing legal debate and rejected apologies.
Right.
And then you have the British model, which paid massive compensation to the owners, solidifying British capital, and is now being pressured into non-cash structural repair. Which approach truly addresses the intergenerational efficiency of the harm, and which one provides a better, more equitable model for achieving global equity without undermining the political framework of fairness for the future?